Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Windows on the World. What a week it's been. It's absolutely flown over since our talks in Glastonbury last Saturday. And what an interesting week it's been. Of course, I've been doing a lot of research and lots of stuff is coming the way of Windows on the World, which is great. Because what this does, it actually cements everything together as to what's really happening in the country. And of course, globally, because a lot of the stuff we cover is global and local. Yep, there's no difference. It's being rolled out everywhere. Check our back catalogue for more information on that one. And anyone who listens to the show regularly will know this about the way that global governance is implemented locally. Yeah, it's a big thing that we talk about, and we're going to go into one of the biggest aspects of our lives at the moment, and that's propaganda. What we're talking about tonight is broadly a subject we've covered, and it might be a good idea to look at it in more historical context in programmes to come. Propaganda, that is, and the art of the big lie. Because we are in the post-truth world, and people respond with feelings and emotions, and they blot out facts, which is the absolute epitome of propaganda, and it proves that the propaganda has worked brilliantly. But let's look at this, like the global local agenda is at the heart of the global propaganda industry. There's no doubt about that. And this is the subject of our talks in the bigger picture. This is broadly the sort of stuff we cover. I like to go into more esoteric type subjects as well. We've actually gone off and done lots of shows on that. If you check the back catalogue, I was talking to somebody today about all this stuff. And I think it's always best to simplify things. And this is the problem I have with a lot of academic kind of approaches to the way things are. Academics are generally mentored into the actual programming, and we're going to go into that too, because academics can be the most difficult people to get through to, and also they always have an opinion of everything, even if it's wrong, and they're the most intransient people on the planet, quite frustratingly so, although I do like debating with people who can actually debate. You know, those people who use those three things: logic, grammar and rhetoric. It's called the trivium, and you can tell that the art of propaganda has worked in the respect that logic, grammar and rhetoric, in other words, the ability to express yourself clearly, give an argument which would stand up in court, and do it with absolute logic, is a lost art. There are not many people who can even use grammar anymore. And that's a really interesting thing. So language has been diminished, and that's, of course, by things like Twitter, getting you to put down a meme instead of some actual information. And we're going to get into all that tonight as well. But one of the most important issues that we face at the moment is the sheer amount of administrators, the sheer amount of these administrators that it takes to waste the energy of the public. You'd think they wouldn't need that many now. But of course, this is like it's a useful idiot's industrial complex, isn't it, of paid liars. And I've seen some great examples of that over the last few weeks, and we're going to be reporting on that in the weeks to come. I'm putting some evidence together, and as we do, we like to do things thoroughly so we can give you clarity as to what is actually going on, actually in your local area, and of course the bigger picture. But yeah, the useful idiot's industrial complex. Yeah, has anybody talked about this? I think we have. But this is something I started covering years ago. And it's, as I say, it's available in such articles as Big Society Change Agents. Check that one out. It's got some good links on it, windowsontheworld.net, and in many, many shows on that website, on our website, which you can actually listen to now. It's live. So all our shows go out live on the windowsontheworld.net website. And there's actually a chat box you can get into. And most people prefer not to use the chat box, but for those of you that do, it's always good to see you in there. And it's usually a select few, which is makes it actually funnier, because the people in there tend to talk amongst themselves, and we can actually get into some side issues as well. Well, basically, yeah, let's have a look. Google, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter. This is the new Soviet-style Ministry of Propaganda, and it controls all narratives, or tries to. Now, the censorship going on through the internet is mirrored in the world of these limited choices that we are told is society, or people buy into as society, or let's call it the big society, the world of the community organisers and the army of social entrepreneurs who couldn't run a business if they tried. Yeah, check out that article, Big Society Change Agents. And this is kind of a Soviet-style system that's been imposed, but it's just slightly more up to date and basically controlling the actual public narrative is all it's about. So first, something useful. Let's get into this anyway. There's a talk by 5gawareness.com. That's www, of course, .5, the number 5, G, awareness.com, all lowercase, so it's 5gawareness.com. And there's a talk with questions and answers at the Steiner Academy in Hereford. It's Much Jew Church, it says here, Hereford, HR2, 8DL, on Friday the 14th of June from 7 p.m. onwards. The doors open at 6:30 p.m. This is at the Steiner Academy in Hereford. Adults £5 and £3 concessions, it says here. Very reasonable. It's Chris, who's a listener to the show. And it says inquiries. Chris, you can actually call him. It's 07870 or 07870 149 745. That's Chris. And that's at the Steiner Academy, Friday the 14th of June. So get down there. If you're interested in the 5G agenda, which of course is massive, it's going to lead into the Internet of Things. This is untested technology. Been doing quite a lot of research into it, and I have some findings that we're going to put on next week's show. And your local council is putting this through with no public consultation, and they're going to tell you that the phone companies say it's perfectly safe, and the department, the government department responsible for rolling all this out, the Department of the Environment, all these civil servants are saying that it's safe because they've been told it is, and they repeat what they've been told. The World Health Organization is also repeating that it's safe. However, it's untested technology. And of course, the World Health Organization were recently caught out with their vaccination program in Samoa, where the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine given to children, was found to be completely unsafe. 2 children died, 2 babies actually died. But you can look into all this stuff. And of course, this is part of the propaganda, is saying that people who don't vaccinate their children are a danger to everybody else. Yes, so we're going to get into the propaganda in this week's show. Propaganda is the most important part of the consensus-based reality, and what is quite rightly called the post-truth world, something that is not a stranger to this show. We talk about that a lot. The artificial wombs of unreality, which have now enveloped most of the population and put them into the correct social groups, this is important, are always worth investigating. Well, let's look at the fake left, the fake right, and fake green. The fake green is the new one. The neurotic fringe groups also, which are created and monitored, and they're basically, all these things are the glue that holds the fabric of society together with propaganda. And propaganda's a noun, actually. And the Collins interpretation of it is propaganda is information, often inaccurate information, which a political organisation publishes or broadcasts in order to influence people. Well, it's gone far beyond that, hasn't it? Because the propaganda is coming out of everywhere now. It's not just a political agenda at all. It's much bigger than that. It runs most people's lives all of the time, and they repeat it without thinking, which is the whole purpose of propaganda. The recent shows we've done about these cartoon protests, which revolve basically around narcissism, the narcissism of those involved. This is a fine example of propaganda at its most simple and effective. We're talking here about Extinction Rebellion, and it doesn't get any more stupid than that. And this has taken off really quickly, and it means that the social engineers have been able to completely dumb down all attempts at critical thought in, get this, well, let's have a look how many people are following it. Probably about 30% of the population are actually following this. If you go to certain areas, now it's not the same in every area, but in a lot of areas, you're getting up to 30% of the population, especially where you've got the millennials and the 30-somethings who've been mentored into this program. And this is basically, later in the show, we'll be looking at how the term conspiracy theory is backfiring. This propaganda is actually backfiring, so there is some good news. And it has been for some time, but there may be a critical mass. Going to get into that as well in tonight's show. One thing that is important is not to overdo the negative attachment terms, and this is where it's starting to fall apart. So the propaganda on some levels is starting to fall apart, this idea of negative attachment. In other words, you've got to be one of the four. You've got to be a Nazi, a fascist, a white supremacist, a Holocaust. What's the other one? Not the, not that one. Not the Holocaust denier one. We talk about the anti-Semitism one. That's one, and there's several more, but not many. So basically, we've got this whole narrative where negative attachments are attached to what you're talking about, even if you're not talking about what they're talking about. It's absolutely insane. This is a great example of the post-truth world. So when propaganda becomes too ingrained to resist, and it has become part of the individual's identity and a reflection of the group identity, then its mission is complete. And propaganda is not just about lies. It can mix lies with truth, and often does, and it distorts the individual's ability to think or see reality. And it has to be continuous. Continuous propaganda exceeds the individual's capacities for attention or adaptation, and thus his capabilities of resistance. I think that's really important. I'm going to read that again. Continuous propaganda exceeds the individual's capacities for attention or adaptation, and thus his capabilities of resistance. This trait of continuity explains why propaganda can indulge in sudden twists and turns. That's interesting, isn't it? It is always surprising that the content of propaganda can be so inconsistent that it can approve today what it condemned yesterday. Well, global cooling to global warming, the war on terror, from Islam to the fake far right being announced by MI5, that's the new terror threat, which doesn't exist. So we find these things happening all the time. And isn't it strange that things come and go like fashion and people accept them and they just repeat them without thinking? So if it's in the fake news media, then it's repeated instantaneously, and it's almost like what came before it never existed. This is all to do with the short attention span that's being implemented through these social media platforms, which is incredibly interesting and part of the propaganda narrative. But the psychological programming of individuals is more complete in those who are mentored into the system and academics, and those who go through the system and end up in public office. And these are the most brainwashed, and also they often have shallow self-interest to back up their indoctrination. This is a thing we talk about all the time. And climate catastrophophobia is the most effective and important to global control system. The global control system absolutely relies on this now. It's put all of its eggs in one basket, so it has to push this narrative night and day. So the war on terror sort of now pales in comparison to it. The war on terror, post 9/11, is now been kind of marginalised with this, and of course the fake far right and the rise of the fake green movement, which is of course just an arm of the state, which we've covered on so many shows. Well, it's arm of the taxation and control system. But the climate change religion is meant to unite everyone, the whole human race. It's a new world religion and a massive control system, and of course a business plan, most importantly of all. So the best psychological warfare mechanism is this. It's the most important one in recent world history, the climate change agenda. There's never been anything like it. Check out the constant daily propaganda in the UK Guardian with its psychological warfare of fear-mongering about an imminent but never defined forthcoming catastrophe which will result from humans being on the planet through affecting global temperatures, which we say are going to rise a few degrees. But the cows aren't let off either, are they? And the funny thing is that volcanoes are left out, and the relentless fact-free narrative then becomes a continuum. It's like a never-ending onslaught. And this is the very essence of propaganda. So let's talk about propaganda. I was sent a very brilliant book this week, which I haven't had a chance to read all the way through. And it was from Per in Sweden, who sends me a lot of great stuff every week. And it's by Jacques Ellul, and it was called Propaganda. The first edition in France came out in 1962. It was republished in 1965 and again in 1973. And it was called Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes, and of course women's. And it's a book on the subject of propaganda by the French philosopher, theologian, legal scholar, and sociologist Jacques Ellul. That's Jacques, E-L-L-U-L, and you can download this as a free PDF on the internet. He wrote another book as well called A Technocratic Society, which is also brilliant. I've just skimmed through it and I'll definitely be reading that one. But you can download these books, and along with a lot of the other stuff we've covered, I think this is really important to get your head around now, because this kind of propaganda, the actual mission of propaganda is pretty much complete, but it's never been so more banal and so dumbed down as it is now. So this book appears to be the first attempt to study propaganda from a sociological approach as well as a psychological one. So most people are easy prey for propaganda, Ellul says. This is from the introduction. They're easy prey because of their firm but entirely erroneous conviction that it is composed only of lies and tall stories. So propaganda can actually mix the truth and lies. This is very important, and that says, conversely, what is true cannot be propaganda. Well, we all are guilty of propagandizing, and we usually form an argument with propagandized statements. So this is all very interesting, and it ties in a lot to our belief systems and how we're brought up, and we have to constantly be readjusting this if we are to get anywhere with argument. We have to constantly be analysing ourselves as to how accurate we are being, and this is what's missing from the narrative of public opinion in what we now call society. But getting back to the introduction of the book, it says, the most trenchant distinction made by Ellul is between agitation propaganda and integration propaganda. So agitation propaganda leads people from mere resentment to rebellion. So you control the narrative through exploiting people's anger. And this is a great tool that's used all the time. Remember that quote? I actually put it in my talk. It's from a change agent organisation called Unlimited from 2010, when David Cameron, UK Prime Minister's big society narrative was pushed out into the public domain with the use of Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. Saul Alinsky, the radical housing campaigner. Basically, you could say in some ways domestic terrorist, because some of these Saul Alinsky tactics are bordering on terrorism, or could actually be classified as terrorism under the Terrorism Act if they're taken to the extreme. But this group called Unlimited in parliamentary documents said the result of the cuts, which is the austerity which was to come, the result of the cuts will be one of anger. The idea of the big society is to galvanise that energy. Basically what they were trying to do is funnel people's energy into useless things which basically dissipate the energy. And most of this is about controlling energy. A big part of the technocratic society is all about the harvesting of energy. In other words, your energy is harvested through work and through taxation and giving money to the state. But then when you're not working, your leisure time has to be wasted, so that it can't be useful in the respect of actually analysing society, which would make sense if you're a social engineer. However, let's get back to this. The most trenchant distinction made by Ellul is between the agitation propaganda and integration propaganda. So agitation propaganda goes from resentment to rebellion. And now we just have kind of narcissism to rebellion, don't we? We have something for narcissists to pretend they're rebelling about. Things have got even more absurd. I wonder what Jacques Ellul would think now about what's going on. I think he'd be chuckling to himself, really. But Yes, the latter, integration propaganda, aims at making people adjust themselves to desired patterns. So in other words, how they fit into society. So in other words, you're demonized if you're outside the controlled narrative of public opinion. And the only way around that is to dwell in truth, natural law. The natural law that's inherent, which has been wiped out by the use of propaganda in society. And the whole role of the agents of change within society is to promote lies. That's all they do. So this is a really interesting way of getting into the subject of propaganda. So always exploit the need for habit and repetition. I've made a note of that because it's so important. The need for habit and repetition is innate in people. Well, how many times do you like listening to your favourite song? You put it on and you repeat it. You've heard it once, but you like hearing it 1,000 times because it makes you feel good. And a lot of these repeated memes are exactly the same. Well, look at Greta Thunberg's latest hit, number one for the 11th week. It's Our House is on Fire. Who could forget that one? Not the catchiest tune around, but never mind. But the two types of propaganda that we're talking about here, agitation propaganda and integration propaganda, rely on entirely different means. Both exist all over the world. Integration propaganda is needed especially for the technological society to flourish. Remember, this was written in 1962 in France, published here in 1965. So that's incredibly interesting, isn't it? So integration propaganda is needed especially for the technological society to flourish and its technological means. Mass media among them, in turn, makes such integration propaganda possible. Now, it's off the charts these days, isn't it? But remember that this was written in the 60s and propaganda has become even more repetitious and dumbed down to suit its target audience. It operates instead with many different lands of truth, it says here, half-truth, limited truth, truth out of context. Well, the post-truth world, what could be more descriptive than that? But it says here, even Goebbels always insisted that Wehrmacht communiques be as accurate as possible. And that's a great one, isn't it? Because Goebbels always gets blamed as being the one who is kind of responsible for the big lie. But what he was actually doing is exposing it and saying, this is the big lie. So this is all part of the post-truth world as well, the mixing up. That's what he's just referred to there. Basically, that the mass media and the integration of propaganda, this is the way it works. It works every day in the newspapers like this. And of course, in the fake news media, which gets its PR stories from Associated Foreign Press and and Associated Press, and of course Reuters. So these are just merely PR agencies now for propaganda. But a brilliant point brought up in the book is that it says here, a related point central in Ellul's thesis, this is Jacques Ellul, who wrote the book Propaganda, is that modern propaganda cannot work without, in inverted commas here, education. He thus reverses the widespread notion that education is the best prophylactic against propaganda. What a brilliant point that is. Education now is propaganda. So he says, on the contrary, he says, education, or what usually goes by that word in the modern world, is the absolute prerequisite for propaganda. In fact, education is largely identical with what Ellul calls pre-propaganda, the conditioning of minds with vast amounts of incoherent information already dispensed for ulterior purposes and posing as facts in inverted commas and as education in inverted commas. Ellul follows through by designating intellectuals as virtually the most vulnerable to all modern propaganda for three reasons. Now, this is such a central point. You try arguing with an academic and they will shut you down with the most close-minded response and often the most naive response you could possibly imagine. These are the reasons, these are the three reasons that he designates intellectuals as virtually the most vulnerable of all to modern propaganda. Here's reason one. They absorb the largest amount of second-hand, unverifiable information. 2, they feel a compelling need to have an opinion on every important question of our time, and thus easily succumb to opinions offered to them by propaganda on all such indigestible pieces of information. 3, they consider themselves capable of judging for themselves. Have you heard this one before? I have. They literally need propaganda. In fact, the need for propaganda on the part of the propagandee is one of the most powerful elements of Ellul's thesis. What an important point, the need for propaganda. So the need for propaganda on the part of the propagandee is one of the most important and powerful elements of this thesis, of this book. Cast out of the disintegrating microgroups of the past, such as family, church or village, the individual is plunged into mass society and thrown back upon his own inadequate resources, his isolation, his loneliness, his ineffectuality. People feel ineffectual, they feel angry, and of course the globalists, as we call them, need the anti-globalists to implement their agendas. This is what these new protest groups are all about, the fake protest groups. The Global Action Plan needs them, so it gives them something to do. It organises the protests for them. What could be easier? It makes everything easier, doesn't it? In other words, there's no need for protest to be organised. You just turn up. Propaganda then hands him in veritable abundance what he needs: personal involvement and participation in important events, an outlet, an excuse for some of his more doubtful impulses, righteousness, all factitious, of course, to be sure, all more or less spurious, but he drinks it all and asks for more. Well, this is exactly what it's about, isn't it? It's about the need for constant propaganda. Without this intense collaboration by the propagandee, the propagandist would be helpless. Thus, propaganda, by first creating pseudo-needs through pre-propaganda and then providing pseudo-satisfactions for them, is pernicious. Wow, that's a really interesting and truth-filled statement. So, propaganda, by first creating these pseudo-needs through pre-propaganda, priming the individual into the group, and then providing the pseudo-satisfaction for them, is pernicious. So, in other words, they turn up for the protest, they're given a banner, they shout a few slogans, they see a little bit of a scuffle, and they think it's going to change things. And of course it never does, but they go home kind of exhausted and feeling good about themselves. What could be better? That's the public interest. That's what the public interest is all about, that level of propaganda. So he now goes into the different types of propaganda, and this one we're going to start off with is psychological action. Psychological action. The propagandist seeks to modify opinions by purely psychological means. Most often he pursues a semi-educative objective, and addresses himself to his fellow citizens. Doesn't this all sound a bit familiar? That's a really good one. Let's get on to the next one. Psychological warfare. Psychological warfare. Here the propagandist is dealing with a foreign adversary whose morale he seeks to destroy by psychological means, so that the opponent begins to doubt the validity of his beliefs and actions. Now, this is used against individuals, even at local authority council meetings. The Delphi technique, which we talk about a lot, which was invented by the Rand Corporation in the 1950s to gain what they call group consensus with facilitators and co-facilitators and people around the room controlling the narrative, use this type of basic psychological action, psychological warfare, basically like they're dealing with you as an adversary and trying to destroy your morale by psychological means, which is undermining, saying that you're being selfish, you aren't taking into account the needs of the group, you're being aggressive, you are being a conspiracy theorist, all this sort of stuff which isolates you from the group. So psychological warfare can work for whole countries, which is how it was invented, or just on the individual in your local council meeting. So let's get on to the next one. Re-education and brainwashing. Complex methods of transforming an adversary into an ally, which can be used only on prisoners. Well, This is interesting, isn't it? Because under this UN Global Action Plan, Agenda 2030, the world is a prison and we are prisoners. This is the whole point of it. That's a really interesting one. Complex methods of transforming an adversary into an ally, which can be used only on prisoners. Well, that one's been updated slightly, hasn't it? Let's get on to the next one. Public and human relations. These must necessarily be included in propaganda. This statement may shock some readers, but we shall show that these activities are propaganda because they seek to adapt the individual to a society, to a living standard, to an activity. They serve to make him conform, which is the aim of all propaganda. Public and human relations. Public relations. Who's running your local council? PR companies. Who's getting the fake consensus for that new housing development? Public relations people. They're isolating anybody who goes against it, and they're promoting everyone who are the useful idiots that they can recruit. So, very, very important part. Public and human relations. Basically, one of the most important things that's happening, I think. It carries on here. If by chance propaganda is addressed to an organised group, it can have practically no effect on individuals before that group has been fragmented. Now, this is one of the most important things in this first part of the book, Propaganda by Jacques Ellul. If by chance propaganda is addressed to an organised group, it can have practically no effect on individuals before that group has been fragmented or controlled. Again, we're talking about group consensus. Group consensus has to be gained through the use of these different types of propaganda and psychological warfare. So none of this is a conspiracy theory, is it? This is just the way that the technocratic society controls the narrative of public opinion. So really interesting stuff, this. Yeah, the transformation of very small groups by purely psychological means is one of the most important techniques of propaganda, or very large groups. Look at this Extinction Rebellion. That's absolutely incredible. And the level of propaganda in that is absolutely banal, but it seems to have worked. He says only when very small groups are thus annihilated, when the individual finds no more defences, no equilibrium, no resistance exercised by the group to which he belongs, does total action by propaganda become possible. Now, this is a really important point because this also goes into what they call ideological subversion, the old Soviet method of breaking people down. In other words, if a group stands strong together, it can never be subverted. And I see so many examples of this. It only takes one bad apple in a group to subvert the whole group. They'll start whispering campaigns. They'll set one person against each other. They'll distract people into issues of no importance. In other words, gossip and absolute banal nonsense, which has nothing to do with an argument, a legal argument. Everything has to be kind of put down in these terms to simplify it, I think. So I've seen this so many times. And of course, the takeover of things like Occupy, which had many very interesting people. Even we had one on the show, a chap called Tim Sanders, who was giving really lucid information about the financial system, and still doing it. But of course, all these people are marginalised out, and the state drones come in and take over, recruit the useful idiots, and next thing, you've got everyone chanting slogans such as, "We want a sustainable future," "Whose streets are streets," all this kind of nonsense, which doesn't actually mean anything, which the social engineers must be laughing their heads off at, because if you can get people to chant slogans with no real meaning and no content, then propaganda is complete. So, carrying on with this, it says, instead, basically when the small groups are thus annihilated, when the individual finds no more defences, no equilibrium, that's important. Destabilisation is a huge part of this, and no resistance exercised by the group to which he belongs. Total action by propaganda then becomes possible. So in other words, if you cannot be subverted, if you're standing in natural law and you all have the same aim, you can't be subverted. Subversion can only then happen by whispering campaigns and undermining of individuals within the group. Very important point now. So it says instead, successful propaganda will occupy every movement of the individual's life through posters and loudspeakers. Well, remember, this was 1962. I mean, look what we've got now. It's a constant barrage of propaganda. When he is out walking, through radio and newspapers at home, through meetings and movies in the evening. Now, of course, films are absolutely the ideal project for propaganda because they engage the emotions, they engage the feelings with music and pictures. I learned this years ago that's why I can't watch films anymore. I can take them apart so easily. So in other words, I'm watching the actors, I'm looking at the script, I'm looking at where it's cut, I'm looking at what the director's doing, and often I lose track of what the story is because I'm taking it apart first of all as a technical exercise, and then I'll look at the story. So it's very rare that a film can actually engage you. There are some really good films. I mean, one I really like is Night of the Hunter. It's released in the 1950s, I think, with Robert Mitchum. That was hacked to pieces because the director wasn't liked in Hollywood, Charles Lawton. But that is still a masterpiece of cinema, and everything about it is genius. But it's been hacked together with bad editing because they wanted to undermine the guy. But there's certain films like that which engage the emotion, but they also have an inner truth. But I don't get that with most movies these days. Bit of a digression, that one. But, however, getting back to this, Jacques Ellul says, this is why it is fatal to the effectiveness of propaganda to proceed in spurts. In other words, it has to be continuous, with big noisy campaigns separated by long gaps. Now, this is one of the most key things. This is what Extinction Rebellion have been doing. They've been keeping going their narrative of basically activism through engagement of people into social activities like lying down in Waitrose. Let's go and lie down in Waitrose. Let's glue ourselves to a building today. Let's do this. It's full of activities. It's like a kind of creche for people who need something to do. And that's what he's talking about here. You have to keep the momentum going. And in actual fact, this is one of the Saul Alinsky rules, is that when they victimize somebody or a group, the action has to be relentless. You can never give up, and you have to keep constantly throwing accusations, making them defend themselves, throwing in false claims about them. This has happened to me, and after a while you realize that this stuff becomes more ineffective the longer it goes. So if you can keep going, then this stuff just becomes exposed. It exposes itself, and that's a very important thing with this sort of psychological warfare stuff. And as your kind of progression through things gets more sophisticated, you can easily sidestep it. And that's what I find that's really interesting about what's going on at the moment with these fake protest groups and the promotion of the whole fake green agenda side issue. But basically, in such circumstances where campaigns are separated by these long gaps, the individual will always find his bearings again. He will know how to distinguish propaganda from the rest of what the press carries in normal times. Moreover, the more intense the propaganda campaign, the more alert he will become, comparing this sudden intensity with the great calm that reigned before. Very important, that, to keep things in constant turmoil. That's a huge part of this. And the war on terror, of course, was trying to do that. And then it became terror on the cheap, with terrorist acts being carried out with vehicles, which basically are just car accidents, They may be intentional, but really terrorism loses its impact when it's just a car accident. And this is what it became before, of course, we're getting bombarded now with the whole climate change catastrophophobia. But really interesting points there. He says, you've got to keep, says calculating the effect of one or another slogan or of replacing one campaign with another. So basically, an organisation is required that controls the mass media. It's capable of using all these things correctly and constantly. He says every modern state is expected to have a ministry of propaganda, whatever its actual name may be. Now, we're in a time of numerous ministries of propaganda. We've covered the numerous think tanks and government-backed propaganda outlets, such as the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and the Research Information Communications Unit, who are basically putting out these fake memes about Russia. And we've covered all that in the recent weeks. And of course, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations and the British Psychological Association, all these put out these papers and they get into the mainstream news. And of course, Demos, the public policy think tank, which stated that the new democracy will work with a combination of open infiltration by government groups and basically they would be taking over the controlling of public narratives. And we sort of refer to all this stuff in the talks, and it's quite shocking the way they actually lay this out in front of the public. So these are all coming out of the not very aptly named intelligence services. Not very aptly named anymore because there's not much intelligence that comes out of them. But when we do the talks, I get really into all this background, and we've done so many shows on these organisations that are basically controlling the narrative of public opinion, and it's just a huge industry of useful idiots. So the new democracy will work with a combination of open infiltration and citizens groups, these controlled groups taking direct action. What does Extinction Rebellion do? Direct action. And Gail Bradbrook said that she wanted to normalise civil disobedience. When you normalise anything, you neutralise it. It's almost like she could be reading from the KGB handbook when she says things like that. This is this Gail Bradbrook who is the founder really of Extinction Rebellion, along with a couple of other subversives who we've talked about in previous weeks. And it's interesting actually, they go into Goebbels, who was the subject of propaganda. I don't know whether we've got time, but that's a really interesting thing actually, because if you look into the whole history of that idea that Goebbels and the big lie, look into actually what it was about if you get time. Well, as we've got 45 minutes left, and we're going to talk now about a continuum of this, the most believed conspiracy theories in America. Now, this is an interesting thing. It's interesting term. It's now moving away from being an insult. So the conspiracy theory insult has been reversed into a term of endearment amongst researchers who get labelled with it. It's the only it's only now the sort of terminally uninformed who still get away with using it. Admittedly, there are a lot of them, but it's now a sign those who have no argument are clinging desperately to this meme, to the sinking ship of propaganda. So this is the kind of encouraging thing. But this is the interesting thing about the current level of propaganda, and it's one-size-fits-all simplicity. So once you've been called a Nazi, a fascist, a white supremacist, or even an anti-Semite over and over, it's easy to prove that shows that this level of stupidity is pretty now overwhelmed, and it's getting tired and actually quite boring. Now, these terms no longer shock, and that's the point. So the propaganda terms no longer shock. They are so overused that they're in danger of becoming inverted, which is, I think, the interesting part of all this about propaganda. But not, of course, to the administrators and academics who repeat whatever they are told, but to anyone with more than one functioning brain cell. They can now see this. So we're going to go on to this latest US poll. And it's interesting and shows how far the term conspiracy theory has been stretched beyond its credibility and is actually past its sell-by date. And it's been going on since the 1960s, of course, because it came out of the CIA, the term conspiracy theory. It was for people who entertained ideas that the Kennedy assassination might not be how it actually was played out by the government narrative. And there's been so much done on that. And it's now been so overused, the term has been rendered in most ways quite useless. But this is from the latest YouGov poll. It's in the United States. It's from a company called Statista, who report statistics. Now, it says here, believers in conspiracy theories are usually written off immediately as weirdos and idiots. Oh, really? But as a new survey by YouGov for Statista reveals, in some cases, these are actually widely held beliefs and far from the bizarre fringe opinion that you might have come to expect. Well, I think we can kind of dismiss the stupidity of some of the things in that statement, but some of it is interesting. According to the survey, One of the most commonly believed conspiracy theories amongst US adults is that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone in the assassination of JFK. 47% believe either strongly or somewhat that there was in fact another shooter behind the grassy knoll. President Trump's often touted theory of the deep state has also, to a fair degree, made it into common discourse, with 29% believing it to some extent. Now, let's go through this. I've got the graph here. It says, the Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone in assassinating JFK. 47% of Americans believe that. That there is a deep state working against US President Donald Trump and his supporters. 29% believe that. The government is hiding aliens in Area 51. Well, that comes in at 27%. 9/11 was an inside job, which is actually quite a misleading term, really. That term inside job is a propaganda term within itself, really. 23% believe that. Now, I think that is inaccurate. I really think that one is quite inaccurate. So I'm starting to doubt this poll because most people I speak to, well, maybe outside the United States, no, it wasn't as reported, at least. Here we go. The Illuminati secretly control the world. Well, 21% believe that, but there's so much disinformation around this Illuminati thing, from rappers to these people who claim to be fake members of it or victims of it and all the rest. I mean, this is really the kind of world of the so-called conspiracy theorist, Really, this whole thing we talk about in our bigger picture talks, really, the way that, let's look at it this way, a business plan. There's no secrets, really. Secret societies, well, if they were secret, we wouldn't know anything about them, would we? But we know quite a lot about so-called secret societies. So this Illuminati secretly control the world is, again, a propaganda statement, in my opinion. 21% of people believe that. Well, it's so banal in a way. And the people who are illuminated, or the priest class, would be laughing at that one, in my opinion. The government is using chemicals to control the population, in brackets chemtrails. Well, that's another kind of propagandized statement, which doesn't go into geoengineering. Again, it's very easy to debunk that statement for people within the system. The government is using chemicals to control the population. Well, geoengineering isn't exactly that, is it? 19% of Americans believe that, however. The moon landing was faked. Now, only 11% of people believe that. Now, I think that's incredibly disappointing because in the world of television, and when people look and analyse television, film, any of the rest of it, if you start off with the photographs, then go into the technology, it all opens itself up. And we've been through all this in many shows, but that's an incredibly disappointing figure that only 11% of Americans think the moon landings were faked. So this is a comment from Per in Sweden. He says, these figures bring to mind CIA Director William Casey's motto that our disinformation program will be complete when everything the American public believe is false. Yeah, that's quite a well-known statement, but an important one. He says, they're not quite there yet, but that doesn't matter much. After all, as long as the incredulous are a minority, they don't threaten the controlled democratic regime, which is, of course, is the whole issue of propaganda. It doesn't matter whether there's a few people who know what's going on. They just can't let it hit a critical mass. That's the most important thing. And everything is being thrown now at the public to stop any form of critical mass or even a minority group emerging. Of course, fake left, fake right, fake hate, fake everything. He carries on. Abraham Lincoln famously quipped that you cannot fool all of the people all of the time, but then in a democratic system it's not necessary. All you need to do is fool the majority of voters all the time. In America, the majority of voters means about 1/4 of the adult population. So if you can fool 30%, you're good. Now, I think this brings us back to what I was saying at the beginning of the show, that this 30% is a really important figure, and it's something that can be aimed at because it's the power of groups lies in their effectiveness and their ability not to be infiltrated and taken over. And that means getting rid of people who listen to gossip, who are basically not very single-minded and cannot think straight, because people who can't think straight will always be diverted onto issues of no importance. That's I think is a really, really key point here. And I'm going to read out something which I think is very important. But first, to do that, we're going to be doing more on the 5G issue in the weeks to come, and we have covered it, but we're getting some really interesting information coming in from councils around the country, so I'm going to hold off this week on that. But in the week which Bristol was raising concerns about 5G, we also see that Florence, Geneva, Brussels are all stalling the rollout of 5G. So this is actually becoming quite a big thing. And I think a lot of these councils in the UK are going to get quite worried about it. Remember, this is all about personal indemnity. Who indemnifies people to sign this stuff off? I've had great results with going after the personal indemnity of the person who actually makes the claim. That's what it's all about. If that sounds complicated to you, it isn't. It's all about public liability of public servants. Oh, remember, when they used to be public servants before we were assumed to serve them. So basically, the template of the gatekeepers and local officials, especially from parish councils, is textbook. And it's all there. Obfuscation, implausible deniability. I love that one. Implausible deniability. And worst of all, the allegations that the nose in the trough public servants are feeling hurt about it all, or they're being somehow intimidated by the public who are merely expressing an opinion. This is all important stuff, and stuff that is used over and over again. And I think it's incredibly important to bring everything down to the local level. And what I'm going to do is finish off with a mission statement, which is really important. And I finish off in our talks, The Bigger Picture. I put it at the end of my talk. And a few people are latching onto this. So let's go through what it says, because basically it puts public officials on the spot and removes propaganda, which in a way is what this show has been all about. This is the conclusion to it, really. So this is a mission statement that anybody can use. If you're a group, you can state, we are an unaffiliated group of local residents concerned about the lack of democratic process in local government planning and policy. So in other words, we're not affiliated to anybody. You cannot label us. You cannot smear us with anything. We have one aim, and this is it. Anything else is a distraction and it's not on the table. Also, you need everything to be put on paper when you're either going into court or a council meeting. Doesn't matter. It's all on paper and has to be served on the people who are going to read it first. Anything that's said is of no use whatsoever. And also another thing you should do is record all public meetings, because officials, shock horror, lie all the time. This is part of the post-truth world. It's all about their feelings and their noses being in the trough. They lie pretty much all the time. This is because natural law has been taken out of the equation. There's no honour among thieves. And we're talking about a group of people here who are not to be trusted. And trust is a very important thing, because the role of trustee in public life is absolute. Public trustees have to fulfill their objectives. And I've had great success with putting my information to public trustees who should fulfill their objectives. Of course, there's treacherous ones. They're usually the ones that are promoted and parachuted into positions. But the ones slightly higher up or with a brain cell know that they are publicly liable for certain things. And it always has to come back to indemnity. Who indemnified you? Who underwrites these people to make decisions on your behalf, which they could be liable for? It's all about obfuscation and getting rid of public liability. And that's what has to be brought back. So we are an unaffiliated group of local residents. That means that you're not part of their local action group, which they control. All councils have these local action groups, which they control with their plants. This is the new system based on the old Soviet system, communitarianism, it's, as we say every week, it's bigger than communism. We are an unaffiliated group of local residents concerned about the lack of democratic process in local government planning and policy. Well, it's meant to be democratic, isn't it? They may hoodwink people, but it's meant to be democratic. It carries on. We will remain unaffiliated as individuals acting collectively. In other words, we're not a group that you can label. We're individuals acting collectively with one aim. So we will remain unaffiliated as individuals acting collectively and within the law. Very important point here. Always state you're acting within the law, because they often accuse you of being lawless, or they accuse you of some fake crime. We will remain unaffiliated as individuals acting collectively and within the law towards a truly inclusive democratic process where all voices are heard. Well, they say it, don't they? Vibrant communities, diversity. These are their key words. So they can't go against them, can they? Because it's meant to be democratic, isn't it? All right, we know they're using subversive tactics, but it's meant to be democratic. So we will remain unaffiliated as individuals acting collectively and within the law towards a truly inclusive democratic process where all voices are heard. They can't say no to that, can they? That gets them every time. Here's another point. We are not affiliated with any group or organisation whatsoever. In other words, your group doesn't have a name. You're just a group who's come together with this issue. The group has no name, therefore it cannot be slandered or infiltrated or diverted. Very important point. Next point. This does not mean that we do or do not endorse other groups. In other words, you can't tie us to any negative associations either. You can't tie us to some far-right meme or whatever you want to do. You can't say we're racist. You can't say we're anti-Semitic. Basically, whatever, fascist, Nazis, whatever you want to say. We are not affiliated with any group or organisation whatsoever. Next bit is very important. This does not mean that we do or do not endorse other groups. In other words, we may endorse other things, we may not. It's nothing to do with why we're here, however. Next one, we do not agree with arriving at, guess what? Consensus through being steered into predetermined outcomes by trained facilitators, either working for the council or public-private partnerships. That removes their little gravy train and their little control system. We do not agree with arriving at a consensus. In other words, if there's a facilitator there, tell the council that you're going to elect your own from the group as the spokesperson to hand in the information they should have read before the meeting, which needs to be discussed now, as they're all public servants and the council tax pays their wages. Always remind them of that. So the last one is, we don't agree with arriving at a consensus through being steered into predetermined outcomes, which is what happens everywhere, by trained facilitators employed in the public and private sector. We don't agree with that at all. We deem this to be against the public interest and an affront to democracy. So those points are the most important, I think, to use against propaganda, against the change agents, against those controlling the narrative of public opinion, against the globalists who control the anti-globalists and give them their protests. The globalists need the anti-globalists to implement their agendas. So let's take away the whole area of propaganda, the whole controlling of the narrative of public opinion, bring it down to groups acting as individuals in a group. In other words, everyone agrees. There's no consensus, there's real agreement. So, hope you enjoyed that, everyone. Next week we'll be back with some killer information. And I've quite enjoyed that myself. And I'm going to be reading more from Propaganda by Jacques Ellul. and his book, The Technocratic Society, both released in the early 60s. Now, some of these books are fantastic. Another one I'd recommend is The Psychological Society by Martin L. Gross. Fantastic book and very prescient as to how the public are being controlled through psychological nudging and psychology. This is all a psychological program. So that's it from Windows on the World this week. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. I'll be back 9 p.m. next Sunday. If you've got any information, send it in. Thanks a lot. Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net.